What's up guys, it's Idzi here, welcome back to Yugioh deck of the day. Today we have the Nekroz DRYTRON deck that you've all been requesting. So here it is, the Nekroz deck of a new era. This deck has been adapting pretty much ever since its release, and I know it hasn't been the most relevant deck in the most recent formats, but now it actually has a really good chance of competing because of the new ritual engine that has pretty much been seen playing the meta. We've seen results from tournaments and seen that DRYTRON is actually really good. So if you can incorporate this with the right ritual deck and know how to pilot the deck correctly, then you can pretty much have very much a successful run in any event, because this deck has outs to anything. Nekroz is a deck that is really good going first, really good going second, so no matter what you're playing against, if you know the matchups and you can adapt, you can overcome your opponents. So I'm going to show you the list that I've come up with, and I think that is the correct way to play Nekroz in these days. So before we begin the video, if you enjoy it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So to start off with the Nekroz monsters, we have 3 copies of Nekroz of Unicorn. This card is a 3, and this is so important for this deck because not only because of its effect that it's a floodgate, but mostly because of its secondary effect to discard to add back cards. With this, you can now play only 1 copy of each of the ritual spells, because if you need to use one of them twice, you don't have to search it again from your deck. You can actually get it back from your grave with Unicorn, so you can actually Kaleido twice or Mirror twice without having to play multiple copies, because the ritual spells are the bricks of the deck if you don't have the right monsters to tribute and the right monsters to summon. And since DRYTRONs gave you a new ritual spell that is actually much better than any other ritual spell we've ever had for any generic archetype, so yeah, you don't really need to play a lot of them. So having 3 Unicorn is so important to be able to recycle those resources. 3 copies of Brionac, of course, to search all your monsters. It has the really good on-field effect if you're playing against something that will get a lot of monsters from the extra deck on the field. You can just spin 2 of them back. 2 copies of Clausulus, another interruption if you can get it on the field, but mostly to search your Nekroz ritual spells. And the last monsters for the Nekroz part is 1 copy of Trishula and 1 copy of Valkyries. These 2 are one-offs because they're a little bit bricky. You don't really need to see them early unless you're going second, then you're going to search your Trishula. You can get them back from your grave not only with Cycle now, but the DRYTRON ritual spell also special summons monsters from the grave, so you have access to them much more easily than having to search a Cycle to get them back from the grave. And if you can resolve Trishula more than once against an opponent, then you're pretty much going to win because you're getting so much free advantage. And Valkyries is so much better now because you can tribute the DRYTRON monsters you have on the field to get the draw, and then these DRYTRON monsters can come back from the grave during the next turn, so you can get even more searches. And of course, Valkyries' effect to stop a battle phase can sometimes come in clutch to save you from an OTK. 3 copies of Benten. If you're playing DRYTRON in pretty much any ritual deck, I think you have to include 3 copies of Benten because it's the most free tribute for the DRYTRON monsters that also gives you advantage. Not only can you search Manju, which is basically anything that any deck can play if you're playing ritual, so you can search for a normal summon, but in this particular deck, you're playing Vanity's Ruler anyway. Even before DRYTRONs were a thing, you were playing this as a win condition, so now you have the DRYTRONs to tribute instead of the incantations, but you still get free special summons on the field, so you can actually search it to be able to get that monster on the field that is a win condition against some decks, and if your opponent doesn't have an out in it, they're not going to be able to play the game. And the last ritual monster is the DRYTRON Meteonis Quadrantis. I prefer this one over the one that's kind of a disruption because it's not really a disruption, it just sends a monster on the field as a quick effect, but if that's the only disruption you have on the field, you're not going to win a lot of the time, unless you're playing against something completely rogue, but then you should be able to win anyway. But this card gives something that deck doesn't really have. It kind of struggles against back row decks, especially now Eldritch being so popular. I think you need to play this in your deck just for the option, because you can just blow out your opponent's back row completely, and you can get access to this card whenever you want, and you can summon it multiple times. So even if Eldritch traps float, then yes, you can summon this again during the next turn, so you can blow them up again. So you're pretty much good to go. So this is why this card is here, in order to be able to make sure that you can win against these matchups as well. For the little DRYTRON monsters, we play 3 copies of Alpha. Alpha is the one that searches your ritual monster when it's summoned, and all of these DRYTRON monsters can be summoned from your hand or your graveyard by tributing another DRYTRON monster or a ritual monster, and the amount of advantage you can get this during the late game is absolutely insane. The problem with incantations was that yes, you could get advantage during the early game and get the cards you needed, but these monsters were not doing anything afterwards. These cards, not only can they get you advantage during the late game, but they're also level 1, they do not restrict you from the extra deck, and this is actually so important, but I will get to that once I get to the extra deck. 3 copies of Zeta. Zeta is the one that adds you your ritual spells, and I play 1 copy of Delta. I just wanted to play 1 more DRYTRON, but the problem is that they don't have the best effects. So this one helps you reveal a ritual monster, ritual spell in your hand, and then draw a card. It's not the worst effect, and I just wanted to play 1 more copy of a DRYTRON in order to be able to search a different one in case I have both Alpha and Zeta in the early game, which you should try to do, because this is how you get access to both your monsters and your spells whenever you want to. So if I get to draw another copy of Nova, then I have something different to get even more advantage of instead of getting something that I already have. And for the normal summons, play of course one copy of Vanity's Ruler and one copy of Manju. These two are both searchable with Ben 10, and the only reason I'm playing Manju is because when you go second, you don't really want to search Vanity's Ruler, because even if you summon it, then if your opponent already has a board and doesn't do anything, but getting access to Manju will give you another search or maybe force another negation, so one of each just to make sure that you have something to do when you're going first or going second. For the spells, let's start with the ritual spells. We have, of course, one copy of Meteonis Drytron. This card is absolutely insane for multiple reasons. First of all, it gives you access to all those monsters from the grave as well from your hand, so you don't even have to play multiple copies of Cycle in order to be able to get your Nekroz monsters from the grave, so you can get them back very easily. And this card recycles itself by just decreasing the attack of one of your Drytrons by 1000 from your grave, so you can get it back whenever you want, and you can use it over and over again. This is the cool thing about a deck like this, is that you don't need a lot of ritual spells to function. This is why it can be so successful, because ritual spells are the bricks, because they don't do anything unless you have the ritual monsters. The ritual monsters in this deck do something even without a ritual spell. They give you recyclability, they give you protection, they give you search power, they give you anything you want. So the more spells you play, the worse your deck becomes. So by cutting numbers actually makes your deck a lot more consistent, because you can get access to them whenever you want, and like I said, with 3 copies of Unicorn, you can get them back from the grave as well, so you don't need to worry about that either. So this is why I play one copy of each of the Nekroz ritual spell. I'm playing one Kaleidoscope, one Mirror, and one Cycle. You don't need anything else. All 3 are important. You need to play all 3 of them. I wouldn't count any of them, but just one copy of each, so you can recycle them and get them whenever you want. You need to be a little bit reluctant about banishing them from the grave for the grave effect to search another one. You usually don't want to banish Kaleidoscope, because it's the one that you want to be getting back with Unicorn in order to get more copies of Herald or NTSS to the grave. The one that you should not be afraid to banish is usually Cycle, because you don't really need it to get back monsters from the grave. You can get them back with Meteonis as well. And Mirror is actually really good when you want to get your Trishula by banishing a Clausulus and a Brianna from the grave. All 3 have their utility, and they also replace themselves very easily if your opponent deals with your board, so it's another plus as well. For the Drytron spells, play of course 3 Drytron Nova. This one special summons a Drytron from the deck. The problem with this is that the Drytron monsters don't really do anything when they're special summoned with anything other than their own effect, but you can just link them away for a Liquid Anima or a Linkuribo to get even more monsters on the field, and then you can get them back from the grave to get another search, and if you tribute it a Benton, then you will get even more pluses. And this deck can actually spam quite a lot. It's something that ritual decks don't really do, because incantations get a lot of monsters on the field, but the problem is that they lock you from the extra deck. So you're having now an engine that doesn't lock you from the extra deck, and you get a lot of monsters on the field, so you get best of both worlds, having a really good ritual engine that can deal with a lot of stuff, and for the stuff that you cannot deal with your actual main deck, then your extra deck now is there to help you. 3 copies of the field spell, Drytron Fafnir, another really good card. It gives you a search for a Drytron spell or trap from your deck when activated. You can play one copy of the trap card if you want. I was playing it in the Cyber Angel version, but I think you don't really need to play it in this particular deck, but it's something to consider if you really like having more options in your deck, so you can search them if you already have access to your Drytrons or your Drytron Nova. And it has an effect that against some matchups can actually come very, very clutch, because it reduces levels of monsters when they're summoned. So if you're playing against something like a PK Fire, then you can completely ruin their strategy by not allowing them to summon Cherubini or Dante, because they require specifically level 3 monsters. So if they summon something like a Tour Guide and they get a Graph from the deck, if you reduce Graph's level, then they pretty much can't do anything, because these 2 monsters are basically useless, and because Tour Guide is on the field, they cannot get another BA on the field. So yeah, that's an effect to keep in mind, because it can come up in a lot of situations. 3 copies of Cyber Emergency. All the Drytron monsters are machines that cannot be normal summon, so you can search them with this very easily, and if your opponent doesn't know what this card does and they use an effect that negates its activation, then you can get it back and activate it again, so that's something to keep in mind as well. 3 copies of Preparation. This is usually you will search Benton if you don't have access to her before you search any of your Nekroz monsters, because you need the free tribute. If you don't have the free tribute, the Drytrons do not feel as powerful, but with Benton they feel insanely broken. So if you don't have Benton, you get Benton first, but if you already have Benton, you can search one of your Unicorns or your Bryanax. And 1 copy of Terraforming, because Fafnir is a really good card, so you need to play as many copies of it as possible. For the extra deck, play for the Synchro monsters 2 copies of Herald of the Arclight. Even though I'm playing 1 Kaleidoscope, like I said, you can get it back from the grave with Unicorn, so you need to play more targets for it. I do not play any of the high levels, you can get multiple Nekroz on the field. That strategy doesn't really do a lot anymore, because you're not getting any advantage, and in this format you need to be able to grind it out, especially with decks like Eldritch being so relevant, so you need to get as much advantage as possible. 1 copy of NTSS for the option to be able to pop cards with Kaleidoscope. For the Exist monsters, play Assembled Nightingale and 1 copy of Zeus. If you have access to Zeus, then you should be playing it in any of the DRYTRON decks because it's such an easy thing to do. You can just overlay 2 monsters for assembly, attack your opponent directly with your effect, and then you can summon Zeus during the main phase 2 and completely blow them. And the good thing about assembly is that you don't have to use only 2 level 1 monsters, so you can actually use 3 DRYTRON monsters to summon her, and she has 3 materials, so when you summon Zeus, you has 4 materials, so you can actually use its effect during your own turn to blow up your opponent's board, and also have its effect as a kind of interruption during your opponent's turn, so you can actually do that as well with Zeus to make it an interruption as well. For the link monsters, play 1 Anima, 1 Linkuribo. These two are extremely important to be able to link away your DRYTRON monsters because Nova doesn't do anything unless you get that DRYTRON monster you summon to the grave, and Anima, if your opponent has something under the extra monster zone, then you can get a free plus out of it by just taking one of their monsters. 1 Hipkoseningen. I like linking DRYTRONs away for this if I have a Unicorn on the field, because even if you summon something like a Masquerena, if you have Unicorn, then it doesn't have an effect because it locks your monsters from the extra deck as well. But this will give you back your Benten when it's sent to the grave, or maybe your Monju, so it gives you an advantage, and you have an extra body on the field, so it's better than just leaving the DRYTRON monsters away, because you want them in the grave anyway, so leaving them on the field doesn't do anything, unless you can tribute them for Valkyries, but that doesn't happen too often, so just summoning this is much better. Play Cerberus, Phoenix, and Unicorn, of course, play the Nightmares, because the extra deck is actually relevant now. Before, when you're playing the Incantation Nekroz deck, the extra deck didn't really do anything aside from being targets from Kaleidoscope, but now DRYTRONs help you get access to the extra deck, so that's also really cool. 1 copy of Ningirsu. When you can get access to Trishula, then this is your best Auto Dragoon, and this is a very good utility card because you don't have to set to the grave. If you just have extra copies of something like a Nova, then you can set it and have an extra 2500 body on the field, so you can get attacks from, because this deck doesn't really OTK unless you get a lot of monsters on the field, but if you're trying to keep advantage, then you should not be trying to OTK, because if your opponent stops you somehow, then this deck is really easy to lose all the resources, because if you're playing Nekroz and you don't really know what you're doing, then you feel like the deck goes neg a lot, but if you know what you're doing, then the deck feels actually really powerful. And for the Link Force, play 1 Appaloosa, 1 Boral Sword, and 1 Borload. All of these can come up, especially Borload, because when you're playing against Dragoon, it's much more optimal to get it for yourself rather than removing from the field with something like a Trishula, so you can have an extra interruption on the field, or if your opponent has a lot of monsters on the field and you can just bait their effects and get their Dragoon, then you can just use Dragoon's effect to destroy their opponent, the rest of their monsters, and pretty much burn them for game this way. So yeah, that's the deck, guys. Nekroz have been renewed. This deck is much more powerful than it ever used to be, except of course when it first came out because it had the Djinn, but I doubt we'll ever get the Djinn back, so I don't think you should be hoping for that. So we should be happy that we have new Ritual support, because Ritual, I think it's the most pretty much wronged mechanic in the game. Konami doesn't really pay much attention to it, so it's fine when you actually get some support for decks, because I know there are a lot of Ritual fans out there, and I'm one of them included, because I really like this deck. So yep, I'm happy that we can get more cards to play with. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.